It was just before dawn in Katsina State, Nigeria. Worshippers gathered for the first prayer of the day. The sound of whispered devotion filled the mosque, but within minutes, those whispers turned to screams. Heavily armed men stormed in, unleashing bullets into the crowd. By the time the gunfire stopped, bodies were scattered across the sacred ground, homes were burning, and families were destroyed. This was not an isolated crime. This was the 2025 Katsina Mosque Massacre, one of the deadliest attacks in Nigeria's recent history. A night of faith turned into a nightmare of blood. Lead up, rising tensions. Northern Nigeria has long lived in the shadow of violence. For years, communities in Katsina State, once known for its bustling markets, ancient mosques, and deeply rooted traditions, have been caught in a storm that seemed impossible to escape. The danger wasn't sudden. It had been building. Villages across the region had already been plagued by bandit attacks, where armed groups raided homes, kidnapped schoolchildren, and demanded ransoms that most families could never pay. Entire towns lived in fear, not knowing when the next assault would come. In some communities, people abandoned their farms altogether, too terrified to step into fields that had once sustained their families for generations. By early 2025, this atmosphere of dread was like dry tinder, one spark away from disaster. Religious spaces, for centuries, had been sanctuaries. The mosque wasn't just a place to pray, it was the one corner of life that still felt safe, where neighbors could come together, seek peace, and leave their worries at the door. But that safety was fragile. Many whispered that it was only a matter of time before the violence outside crept in. And the whispers weren't wrong. Security forces were stretched thin. While Nigerian troops fought insurgents in the northeast, bandit gangs and extremist elements exploited the gaps. Residents of Katsina had pleaded for more protection, warning local officials that their villages were becoming easy targets. Their cries often went unheard. Behind the scenes, local disputes, ethnic tensions, and the lure of ransom money fueled the growth of violent groups. What made this even more chilling was the brazenness of these attackers. They didn't just want money, they wanted power, control, and fear. In the weeks before the massacre, reports circulated of increased militant activity near villages in Katsina. Travelers spoke of strange men on motorbikes, armed, faceless, and moving in groups across the countryside. Some families fled their homes, taking refuge in neighboring towns. Others chose to stay, clinging to hope that their community would be spared. But hope, in Katsina, had become a fragile thing. On the night before the massacre, the mosque stood quiet, its call to prayer echoing across the fields. For worshippers gathering inside, it was a moment of peace. For the attackers watching from the darkness, it was the perfect opportunity. The stage was set. The tension had reached its breaking point. What came next would shatter not just one community, but the conscience of a nation. Inside the mosque, the attack unfolds. The evening prayer had just begun. Inside the mosque, men stood shoulder to shoulder, their voices rising in unison. For a moment, the world outside seemed distant. The fear, the violence, the chaos of daily life, all of it was forgotten as worshippers bowed their heads in devotion. But outside, in the shadows, death was waiting. Dozens of armed men on motorbikes circled the mosque. Their engines were cut, their rifles loaded. They moved with a terrifying calm, as if they had rehearsed this moment 100 times before. The first sign of danger came not from a gunshot, but from a sound. Survivors recall hearing the faint crunch of footsteps on the dry earth, the low murmur of unfamiliar voices. Some thought it was nothing. Others felt their hearts begin to race. And then the doors of the mosque were thrown open, and the attackers stormed inside. Bullets ripped through the air, tearing into walls, windows, and bodies. Worshippers screamed, some diving for cover, others frozen in shock. Within seconds, the sacred space was transformed into a battlefield. Witnesses say the attackers showed no hesitation, no mercy. They fired into the crowd indiscriminately, striking men who were kneeling in prayer, elders who struggled to rise, and even children who had followed their fathers inside. One survivor described the horror. "They came in shooting. People were falling all around me. I tried to crawl toward the corner, but the bullets kept coming. I could hear my brother calling my name, but then his voice was gone. The gunfire was relentless. It wasn't just an attack, it was an execution. Some tried to escape through side doors, only to be cut down as they ran. Others huddled behind pillars, clutching one another, whispering prayers through their tears. The sound of gunfire mixed with cries for help, creating a deafening chorus of terror. Outside, more attackers formed a perimeter, ensuring no one could flee. They fired at anyone who tried to run, their motorbikes ready for a quick escape once the killing was done. For nearly half an hour, the assault continued. 30 minutes that felt like an eternity. 30 minutes in which a place of worship became a slaughterhouse. By the time the gunmen finally withdrew, the mosque floor was slick with blood. Bodies lay scattered among shattered prayer mats and broken sandals. Survivors sat in shock, unable to move, their ears ringing from the gunfire, their minds struggling to process the nightmare they had just lived through. One man later said, "I held my son in my arms. He wasn't moving. I couldn't understand how something like this could happen inside the mosque. I kept asking Allah why. Why us?" As the attackers sped away into the night, their laughter echoed behind them, chilling proof that this was not just violence, but a message. A declaration of fear and dominance. When first responders arrived, what they saw broke them. Even seasoned officers struggled to keep their composure. Many fainted. Others wept openly as they carried the wounded and collected the dead. The attack was over. But for the survivors and for the families of those who never walked out of the mosque again, the nightmare was only beginning. The aftermath, grief and fear. The dust had barely settled in the small community of Katsina when the magnitude of the horror became clear. What was supposed to be an evening of prayer had turned into an unspeakable tragedy. Inside the mosque, blood stained the very mats where men and boys had knelt in devotion only moments earlier. In the hours that followed, families rushed toward the site in desperation. Mothers screamed the names of their children. Fathers carried limp bodies in their arms, weeping openly in a way rarely seen in this culture of quiet resilience. Survivors, trembling and covered in dust, staggered out into the night. Some were too dazed to speak, others repeated the same questions over and over. Why? Why us? Hospitals in nearby towns quickly became overwhelmed. Ambulances and private cars ferried the injured, sirens piercing the night. Doctors and nurses worked frantically, using what little supplies they had. With electricity unreliable, some of the treatments were carried out under the glow of mobile phone flashlights. Blood was in short supply. Relatives lined up, desperate to donate. For those who had lost loved ones, grief was immediate and crushing. Entire families were wiped out. In one case, 3 brothers who had prayed side by side were all killed, leaving behind grieving parents who could barely comprehend the scale of their loss. The burial process began swiftly, in accordance with Islamic tradition. Graves were dug in silence, broken only by sobs and whispered prayers. But the aftermath was not just about mourning, it was about fear. In the days following the massacre, the mosque, once a sanctuary, stood half empty. Worshippers were terrified to gather, afraid the gunmen might return. Some imams reported a dramatic drop in attendance. Parents forbade their children from going to evening prayers. For many, the sacred space had been desecrated beyond repair. The wider community, too, was shaken. Markets grew quiet as people stayed home. Road travel, already dangerous due to banditry, became even more restricted. The sound of motorcycles, often used by armed gangs, would send waves of panic through neighborhoods. Rumors spread quickly, some exaggerated, some true. Nobody knew who might be targeted next. Local authorities tried to respond, but trust in security forces was already dangerously low. Villagers recounted how they had pleaded for more protection in the weeks before the attack, warnings that were ignored. Now, in the wake of bloodshed, those same officials promised justice. But the people had heard such promises before. Journalists who visited the area described a landscape of despair, women clutching photographs of their dead children, elderly men whispering that they would rather abandon their ancestral homes than risk another night of terror. Some families did just that, packing up what little they owned and fleeing toward safer towns. For them, the massacre was not just a tragedy, it was the final push into displacement. Religious leaders stepped forward to calm tempers, urging communities not to give in to anger or seek revenge. But beneath the surface, resentment brewed. Many questioned how armed men could move so freely, strike so brutally, and vanish into the night. The emotional scars ran deep. Children who survived the massacre woke up screaming from nightmares. Some refused to enter a mosque again. Psychologists warned of lasting trauma, not just for individuals but for the collective psyche of an entire region that now associated prayer with danger. Internationally, the massacre sparked condemnation. Human rights organizations demanded accountability, while diaspora groups mourned from afar, raising funds for the survivors. Yet, for those living in Katsina, global sympathy felt distant. What they needed was protection. What they demanded was change. Weeks later, as life tried to return to normal, the memories of that night remained inescapable. The sound of gunfire still echoed in people's minds. Every prayer was shadowed by fear. And in every home touched by loss, an empty seat at the table told the story of lives cut short. The aftermath of the Katsina Mosque Massacre was not measured only in numbers. It was measured in silence where laughter once was. In tears that would not stop flowing. In faith shaken to its core. And for the survivors, one haunting truth lingered. The place they had once believed was safest, the house of God, had become the very stage of their greatest nightmare. Government and security response, Katsina Mosque Massacre. When the echoes of gunfire faded and the cries of survivors carried through the night, the focus shifted from tragedy to accountability. The nation demanded answers. How could armed men storm a place of worship, kill so many, and vanish into the darkness? Immediate reactions. Within hours of the attack, Nigerian authorities confirmed what locals already knew. Dozens had been killed during prayers in a mosque in Katsina local government area, Katsina State. President Bola Ahmed Tinubu condemned the massacre, calling it a heinous act of cowardice against innocent worshippers. His administration promised swift justice, directing security forces to hunt down the attackers and restore order to the troubled region. But promises were not enough. Communities already traumatized by years of banditry and insurgency demanded visible action. Military deployment. The Nigerian army announced immediate reinforcements to the northwest. Special operations units were ordered into Katsina, and the chief of army staff pledged that the perpetrators would face the full weight of military power. Armored vehicles rolled into villages surrounding Katsina. Helicopter gunships began reconnaissance flights, scanning the forests where bandits had long established hidden camps. Checkpoints multiplied overnight along major roads. Security forces wanted to reassure the public, but also to send a clear message to the gunmen: nowhere was safe. State government measures. Governor Dikko Umar Rada of Katsina State declared 3 days of mourning for the victims. He personally visited Katsina, where he promised the families of the dead that his administration would not abandon them. He announced relief packages for survivors and instructed local authorities to strengthen community policing programs. Yet, residents voiced skepticism. For years, many villages had formed their own vigilante groups, known locally as Yen Sakai, because they felt abandoned by formal security forces. This massacre renewed the debate. Could the state really protect its citizens, or were locals forced to defend themselves alone? Police and intelligence operations. The Nigeria police force launched a parallel investigation. Intelligence officers traced the attack to suspected bandit cells operating between Katsina and Zamfara. According to initial findings, the assault on the mosque was not random. It was likely a targeted display of power by a criminal gang seeking to intimidate communities resisting extortion payments. The Inspector General of Police ordered additional tactical squads into Katsina, working with local informants to map out the movement of armed groups. Several arrests were later reported, though questions remained about whether the masterminds were truly caught. National Security Council. The Katsina Mosque Massacre forced the issue all the way to Abuja. The National Security Council convened an emergency meeting, chaired by President Tinubu and attended by service chiefs, intelligence leaders, and governors from affected northern states. Top on the agenda, Nigeria's worsening security crisis. Katsina was not the only state under siege. Neighboring Zamfara, Kaduna, Sokoto, and Niger had also suffered repeated attacks on villages, schools, and religious centers. The council vowed a coordinated offensive to degrade the networks behind the violence. The debate on security strategy. The attack reignited debate within Nigeria itself. For years, security responses had been criticized as reactive rather than preventive. Troops often arrived after massacres had already occurred. Some security experts argued that Nigeria must strengthen intelligence gathering, cut off financing networks of bandit groups, and improve coordination between the army, police, and local vigilantes. Others called for addressing root causes: poverty, unemployment, and lack of education in rural communities, which made it easy for armed groups to recruit and thrive. A public losing faith. Despite the government's strong words and military mobilization, ordinary Nigerians expressed deep frustration. Many pointed out that attacks like this had happened before, and promises of justice rarely translated into lasting safety. For families in Katsina, the government's response felt like déjà vu: speeches, visits, deployments, but little long-term change. Bigger picture, a nation in crisis. The massacre in Katsina was not an isolated tragedy. It was another chapter in a much larger crisis, one that has gripped Nigeria for over a decade. A pattern of violence. From Katsina to Zamfara, Kaduna to Niger, countless rural communities live under constant threat. Armed groups, commonly referred to as bandits, roam with near impunity. They attack villages, kidnap schoolchildren, ambush highways, and now, even storm mosques during prayer. The Katsina Mosque attack symbolized a disturbing evolution, not just targeting wealth or ransoms, but striking directly at the soul of a community, its faith and its sense of sanctuary. The human cost. Across northern Nigeria, thousands have been killed in similar assaults. Tens of thousands have been displaced, forced to flee from farming villages into overcrowded camps or towns where they live as refugees in their own country. Entire regions have lost their farmlands, worsening food insecurity and poverty. Children are growing up surrounded not by classrooms and hope, but by gunfire and fear. For many families, safety has become a luxury they can no longer afford. Roots of the crisis. Experts trace the rise of banditry to several deep-rooted issues. Weak governance in rural areas, where security presence is minimal. Unemployment and poverty, which drive some young men into armed groups. Proliferation of weapons, spilling over from regional conflicts. Distrust between communities and government forces, which fuels cycles of vigilantism and reprisal. The Katsina Massacre exposed not just a security failure, but a social one. A failure of leadership, of institutions, and of trust. Public confidence at breaking point. For ordinary Nigerians, hope is fading. Each attack chips away at the belief that the government can protect its people. Calls for state police, community defense forces, and even negotiations with bandits reveal just how desperate the search for solutions has become. A question of national unity. Nigeria's identity as Africa's most populous nation and largest economy is being tested by this security crisis. The violence in the northwest mirrors other conflicts across the country. Insurgency in the northeast, separatist agitation in the southeast, and farmer-herder clashes in the Middle Belt. The bigger picture is clear. Nigeria is not just battling gunmen in the forests. It is struggling to hold together under the weight of insecurity. The road ahead. For the families of Katsina, the road ahead is filled with grief. But for Nigeria as a whole, it is filled with difficult questions. Can security forces truly reclaim rural areas? Will the government address poverty and inequality that fuel this violence? And how much longer can ordinary citizens bear the burden of living in fear? The massacre was more than a local tragedy. It was a national warning. A reminder that unless urgent steps are taken, the crisis will deepen and the cycle of bloodshed will continue. Bigger picture, a nation in crisis. The massacre in Katsina was not an isolated tragedy. It was another chapter in a much larger crisis, one that has gripped Nigeria for over a decade. The pattern of violence. From Katsina to Zamfara, Kaduna to Niger, countless rural communities live under constant threat. Armed groups, commonly referred to as bandits, roam with near impunity. They attack villages, kidnap schoolchildren, ambush highways, and now, even storm mosques during prayer. The Katsina Mosque attack symbolized a disturbing evolution, not just targeting wealth or ransoms, but striking directly at the soul of a community, its faith and its sense of sanctuary. The human cost. Across northern Nigeria, thousands have been killed in similar assaults. Tens of thousands have been displaced, forced to flee from farming villages into overcrowded camps or towns where they live as refugees in their own country. Entire regions have lost their farmlands, worsening food insecurity and poverty. Children are growing up surrounded not by classrooms and hope, but by gunfire and fear. For many families, safety has become a luxury they can no longer afford. Roots of the crisis. Experts trace the rise of banditry to several deep-rooted issues. Weak governance in rural areas, where security presence is minimal. Unemployment and poverty, which drive some young men into armed groups. Proliferation of weapons, spilling over from regional conflicts. Distrust between communities and government forces, which fuels cycles of vigilantism and reprisal. The Katsina Massacre exposed not just a security failure, but a social one. A failure of leadership, of institutions, and of trust. Public confidence at breaking point. For ordinary Nigerians, hope is fading. Each attack chips away at the belief that the government can protect its people. Calls for state police, community defense forces, and even negotiations with bandits reveal just how desperate the search for solutions has become. A question of national unity. Nigeria's identity as Africa's most populous nation and largest economy is being tested by this security crisis. The violence in the northwest mirrors other conflicts across the country. Insurgency in the northeast, separatist agitation in the southeast, and farmer-herder clashes in the Middle Belt. The bigger picture is clear. Nigeria is not just battling gunmen in the forests. It is struggling to hold together under the weight of insecurity. The road ahead. For the families of Katsina, the road ahead is filled with grief. But for Nigeria as a whole, it is filled with difficult questions. Can security forces truly reclaim rural areas? Will the government address poverty and inequality that fuel this violence? And how much longer can ordinary citizens bear the burden of living in fear? The massacre was more than a local tragedy. It was a national warning. A reminder that unless urgent steps are taken, the crisis will deepen and the cycle of bloodshed will continue. Safety, humanity, and coexistence. What happened in Katsina is not only a Nigerian story, it is a human story. Across the world, from Africa to the Middle East, from Europe to the Americas, communities have felt the pain of violence in places once thought untouchable: schools, churches, synagogues, mosques, markets, and homes. The truth is simple: safety is fragile everywhere. No matter where we live, vigilance matters. Looking out for neighbors, reporting suspicious activities, building stronger communities, and demanding accountability from leaders are responsibilities we all share. But beyond security lies something deeper: the preservation of humanity. Every life matters. Every faith, every culture, every race has the right to exist without fear. When violence targets people because of who they are or where they worship, it attacks the very foundation of what it means to be human. The Katsina Massacre is a reminder to the entire world. When we divide, we weaken. When we hate, we destroy. But when we uphold humanity, we all rise. So wherever you are watching this, remember, peaceful coexistence is not optional, it is essential. Violence may take lives, but intolerance takes away our future. And once life is lost, it can never be recovered.
13 people were killed, according to the press release by the government. But when I went to the community, they told me that at least not less than 45 people, and among that 45, they are not even sure if that is the actual number of people killed, because some were burnt, like beyond recognition, so they don't even know the number of people killed, but they said at least 45. and at least 60-something people were kidnapped. You know, the community was, some of the houses were burnt. These people they are broken. They are angry. Because according to the press release, the Katsina State government said they have deployed security, they have taken security measures. They have deployed security agencies to the village. But to our own surprise, I'm telling you, only there is no single security operatives when we went to Mantau yesterday. Not single security operatives, except the police that escorted us here. They said nobody came. They said when they kept calling and calling when the attack was happening, but nobody was there.